Today I am continuing to read from The Story of Classic Crime in 100 Books by Martin Edwards. Chapter 7. Murder at the Manor. The success of Trent's last case, in which Sigsbee Manderson is murdered in the grounds of his country house, set a pattern for Golden Age detective novels. A tale about murder at the manor offered authors the chance to create a close circle of suspects, principally comprising house guests. The American detective novelist S.S. Van Dyne went so far as to advance the snobbish argument that servants such as butlers, footmen, valets, gamekeepers, cooks, and the like must not be chosen by the author as the culprit. It is a too easy solution. The culprit must be a decidedly worthwhile person. Detective stories in which the butler did it were, contrary to popular belief, few and far between. A country house invariably boasted a library, which sometimes became a crime scene, but more often at the end of the book a suitably august backdrop for the great detective's explanation of who done it and why to those who had survived to the final chapter. It is no coincidence that the first recorded cases of Hercule Poirot, Albert Campion, Sir Clinton Dreffield, and Roderick Alleyn, among countless others, concerned murder in a manor. And when Anthony Berkeley bought a company estate, Linton Hills in Devon, he promptly made use of it as the setting for the second shot. Agatha Christie became familiar with country house life as the result of staying with her sister and brother-in-law in Abney Hill in Cheshire. Abney may have been the model for Chimneys, the stately home which is the setting for her lively thrillers The Secret of Chimneys and The Seven Dials Mystery, and there is no doubt that she fictionalized the house to supply the backdrop for After the Funeral and the title story in The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding. Like Berkeley, Christie eventually acquired a country house of her own, Greenway, in Devon, and is now in the care of the National Trust. In Curtin, an underestimated tour de force published in 1975, but written during the Second World War. Hercule Poirot ended his career where it had begun at Styles Court, when a girl's corpse was discovered at Colonel and Mrs. Bantry's home, Gossington Hall in St. Mary's Mead. Jane Murple was called in to investigate the mystery of the body in the library. By the time Murder and Miss Murple returned to Gossington Hall in the 60s, the Bantrys were long gone, and the house had fallen into the ownership of film star Bernina Gregg. The mirror cracked from side to side. A Christmas Party supplied a popular backdrop for Murder at the Manor novels, including Mavis Doriel Hayes' The Santa Claus Murder, and Christie's Hercule Poirot's Christmas, The Poisoner's Mistake. An early novel by J. Bilton Cobb offers a slight variation, with the New Year's Eve party culminating in the death of one of the guests. By the time Francis Duncan's Murder for Christmas appeared in 1949, the cost of running a country house was proving ruinous. Mordecai Tremaine, a retired tobacconist and amateur sleuth, reflects upon the sadness of a proud family coming slowly to oblivion. The Duncan pseudonym concealed the identity of William Walter Frank Underhill, a former debt collector who became a lecturer in economics. In his other novels included An Inverted Mystery, They'll Never Find Out. The popularity of country house mysteries and the possibility of gaining an inheritance by murder meant that members of the aristocracy appeared in classic crime novels with disproportionate frequency, often as unmourned victims. Georgette Heyer devotes so many pages in Penhallow to establishing the odiousness of the eponymous Lord of the Manor that it's a relief when the inevitable finally happens. Lady Cambers, the busybody strangled in E.R. Punch's Death Comes to Cambers, is another typical Golden Age murderee, who gives a large cast of suspects cause to wish her dead. Punch's regular sleuth, Sergeant Bobby Owen, is conveniently on hand to solve the mystery. A grandson of Lady Hurlpool, he has been staying at Cambers, ostensibly to advise Lady Cambers on precautions to be taken against burglary. Punchon regularly included lords and ladies in his cast of characters, like P.G. Wodehouse. He enjoyed poking fun at those who owed their creature comforts to inherited wealth rather than their own efforts. No detective novelist, not even Lord Gorrell, had such first-hand insight into the country house lifestyle as Henry Wade, the pen name of Sir Henry Lancelot Aubrey Fletcher, 6th Baronet, CVO DSO, who served both as High Sheriff and as Lord Lieutenant of Buckinghamshire. Wade, unlike Punchen and Gorrell, was a conservative by both instinct and inclination, and he seized the opportunity to criticize punitive taxation in No Friendly Drop, in which Inspector John Poole of Scotland Yard investigates the death by poisoning of Lord Grail at the Grail residence, Tassard Hall. The storyline reflects Wade's acute awareness that following the First World War, the landed gentry were living on borrowed time. The hanging captain supplies a plan of the ground floor of the scene of the crime in conventional fashion. Yet whereas Christie portrays Chimneys as a home full of life as well as death, Wade makes clear that Ferris Court, like the family that owns it, is in a state of terminal decline. As for Ferris Court, the Tudor home of 12 generations of Sterons, a glance at the garden was sufficient hint of the shadow which overhung the fine old house. Weed-encumbered beds and paths, untrimmed edges, overgrown shrubberies told their tale of straitened means or neglect sprung from a broken spirit. Sir Herbert Steron is a broken man long before he is found hanging by the neck from a curtain cord in his ancestral home. Wade's deeply rooted pessimism about the future of the country estate was borne out after the Second World War and reflected in Christie's Dead Man's Folly, a murder hunt at a summer fete held in the grounds of a country house with a nouveau riche owner results inevitably in an actual murder. Luckily, Hercule Poirot is present to see justice done. Financial pressures and social change threatened the whole way of life, and the country house mystery came to seem increasingly dated and irrelevant in the austere post-war era. Wade's continuing disdain for severe tax regimes is central to the plot of Too Soon to Die, a notable inverted mystery about the newly impoverished gentry. In the second chapter, Grimly Headed Estate Duties, he recounts the misfortunes of the Gerards of Bracton Manor, one of the oldest families in the country. Nobility in the form of title had never come their way, and distinction had stopped short at honorable and useful mediocrity. But they were Gerards, and whatever extortion might be devised by successive chancellors of the exchequer, they would hold on to Bracton while life remained in their bodies. When the family faces the prospect of financial catastrophe, the solution seems to lie in a cunningly devised fraud. But the revenues suspicious are aroused, and the family's hold on Bracton Manor is jeopardized once John Poole, now elevated to the rank of Chief Inspector, comes on to the rescue. The Crime at Diana's Pool by Victor L. Whitechurch, 1927. Felix Nayland, a mysterious former diplomat, has returned to England after years abroad and acquired a residence for himself and his unmarried sister in the heart of the countryside. The Pleasance nestles below the hills which flank one side of the village of Coppleswick and stands in good-sized grounds with thick woods and a stream that has been dammed so that two natural hollows have become deep pools of water. Nayland decides to introduce himself to the local community by hosting a summer garden party, and the guests include Major Shallow, the chief constable of the county, and Harry Westerham, a young clergyman. Entertainment is supplied by the Green Albanian Band and the Western Glee Singers, but typical of an English summer, the fun is interrupted by a downpour. A member of the band is reported missing, and as Shallow and Westerham stroll away from the gathering, they spot a man's body lying in a pool. The corpse belongs not to the bandsman, but to Nayland, who has been stabbed to death. The Pleasance soon becomes the setting not for a garden party, but a coroner's inquest. Westerham's keen habit of observation makes him a useful ally to the police, whose first suspect inevitably is the missing foreigner. The plot involves the dead man's past in South America and reflects Whitechurch's taste for blending a quintessentially English country house mystery with a touch of the exotic. The author, also a clergyman, surely speaks for himself as well as for Westerham when observing, most people have the extraordinary notion that a parson is something different from an ordinary man, that he lives entirely apart from others in a theological atmosphere. For good measure, he adds, the parson is rarely given credit for the many hours he spends in his study over a variety of matters which would puzzle many a businessman. Westerham is intelligent as well as amiable, and since he has some idea of writing, he may represent a portrayal of the author of a young man. In a preface, Victor Lorenzo Whitechurch explained that he adopted an approach that was at the time unorthodox. In reality, the solver of a problem in criminology has to begin at the beginning, without knowing the end, working it out from clues concerning which he does not recognize the full bearing at first. To begin with, I had no plot. When I had written the first chapter, I did not know why the crime had been committed, who had done it, or how it was done. This was a daring method for an author seeking to set a puzzle, rather than to focus on an evocation of character and setting. Although it was not conducive to fair play detection, as Dorothy L. Sayers complained, he did not put the reader on an equal footing with the detective himself, as regards all clues and discoveries. For her, this was a throwback to the naughty tradition, but she acknowledged that the novel was otherwise excellent. Whitechurch earned election to the Detection Club and contributed to the Floating Admiral, a former chaplain to the Bishop of Oxford. He became honorary canon at Christ Church Cathedral and rural dean of Aylesbury. He created 2 railway detectives, and his most highly regarded work in the crime genre was the collection Thrilling Stories of the Railway. His final detective novel, Murder at the College, was an early example of the Oxford crime story, although he calls his setting Exbridge. Some Must Watch by Ethel Lena White. Helen, aged 19, takes a position quaintly described as a lady help with the Warren family at their lonely country house. The summit is tucked away in a corner on the borderline between England and Wales and looked strangely out of keeping with the savage landscape. Its remoteness makes working there an unattractive proposition for anyone who is not desperate. But Helen is desperate. She is a young woman of her time, a victim of the economic slump. Her one dread was being out of work. Ladies were a drag in the market. Her first job at the age of 14 had been as a walker of the dogs of the rich. The dogs were better fed than she was. Fresh from the misery of unemployment, Helen is only too grateful to have board and lodging and a worthwhile job. After weeks of stringent economy, since starvation is a word not found in ladies' vocabulary, far from ducking the realities of social conditions in the 30s, Ethel Lena White makes them integral to the plot. The new job seems almost too good to be true, and so it proves. At first, Helen finds the spookiness of the summit enticing. Dangers seem to be everywhere, floating in the air, inside the house as well as outside, in the dark dripping valley. But this is not a conventional country house whodunit. A serial killer is at work in the vicinity. He has already killed 4 young women, and a 5th killing takes place uncomfortably close to the summit. The unpleasant nurse to the invalid Lady Warren warns Helen about the murderer. Haven't you noticed that the murderer always chooses girls who earn their own living? The country is crawling with women like maggots, eating up all the jobs, and the men are starved out. Ethel Lena White builds the tension with unobtrusive skill as a ruthless murderer closes in on Helen before an ending which amounts to a form of poetic justice. Some Must Watch was filmed in 1946 by Robert Siodmak, and Mel Dinelli's screenplay was adapted for the stage in 1962. The movie was remade in 1975 with Jacqueline Bisset as Helen and again in 2000. Such longevity attests to White's flair for devising memorable woman in jeopardy storylines, her specialty as novelist and writer of short stories. The most famous film made from her work was The Lady Vanishes, Alfred Hitchcock's classic version of a 1936 novel, The Whale Spins. But the less renowned Midnight House, also known as Her Her Heart in Her Throat, filmed as The Unseen, boasted a screenplay by Raymond Chandler. Ethelina White came from Abergavenny, not far from the borderland setting of Some Must Watch. The daughter of a successful builder, she was one of a family of 12 raised by Welsh nursemaids. She worked in London for the Ministry of Pensions, but left the job on the strength of a £10 offer for a short story, and scratched a living on short stuff for quite some time before my first novel was published. Her favorite form of relaxation was watching films, which perhaps accounts for her knack of writing vivid and suspenseful scenes. Death by Request by Romilly and Catherine John. The Country House Whodunit is like the murder at the vicarage, narrated by a member of the clergy. The Reverend Joseph Colchester had been vicar of Wampish for 26 years, and his distinctive, prissy voice supplies one of the book's incidental pleasures. The book opens with Colchester in reflective mood. It is not without a feeling of horror and reluctance that I take up my pen. Is it really serviceable to perpetuate the memory of so much guilt and wretchedness? I am shocked by the thought that my tale may be read by some as a diversion. He proceeds to describe events that took place 3 years earlier as Friars Cross, the home of Matthew Barry, a friend of Colchester since they were at Oxford together. The guests at Friars Cross include a girl called Phyllis Winter, the glamorous but enigmatic Mrs. Anne Fairfax, Matthew's school friend Colonel Lawrence, and the libidinous young Lord Malvern. Over dinner, they discuss murder and the ethics of capital punishment. Next morning, Malvern's body is found in his bedroom. He has been gassed, and it soon becomes clear that his death was the result of murder, rather than accident or suicide. The dead man's son becomes a prime suspect, as does the butler Frampton, a socialist with a taste for blackmail. Colchester himself has considerable sympathy with the socialist movement, and this is not only the respect in which his personality and attitudes differ from the conventional Golden Age cleric. Inspector Lockett, who leads the police investigation, focuses his attention on Matthew's son, Edward, but the most energetic detective work is done by Nicholas Hatton, a young private investigator, who collaborates with Mrs. Fairfax. However, Mrs. Fairfax, like many of those staying at Friars Cross, is nursing a secret of her own. A surprise solution to the puzzle is followed by an entertaining, if not wholly original twist in an epilogue. The Johns write wittily, and the Colonel's buffoonery is especially well done. Romilly John, seventh son of the celebrated artist Augustus John, described his unconventional upbringing in a memoir, The Seventh Child. Despite his parents' lack of interest in formal education, Romilly went on to study at Cambridge, where he met his future wife, Catherine Tower. They married before either of them graduated. Catherine became a reviewer of the Illustrated London News and a translator of Scandinavian books. Romilly served in the RAF during the war, spent a short time in the civil service, and wrote a poetry, as well as dabbling in physics. The couple never wrote another crime story, but Death by Request is written with such youthful exuberance that it is a shame they failed to continue to play the game. Birthday Party by C.H.P. Kitchen, 1938. Surprisingly overlooked by historians of the genre, this is a country house mystery with a difference. Kitchen's multiple narrators tell a quiet but compelling story in which clues to the truth are psychological rather than material. 4 people connected to Carlisle Abbey relate their versions of events as the viewpoints shift. So does the reader's understanding of the relationships at the heart of the novel? The result is darkly ironic. Isabel Carlisle is a sharp-witted single woman devoted to the Abbey's garden, which she tends with loving care. But a past tragedy haunts the Abbey. 12 years ago, Isabel's brother, Claude Carlisle, died in a mysterious gunroom accident. This was no murder, although it remains unclear whether he died of an accident or suicide. But if he killed himself, what was the reason? Claude's widow, Dora, continues to live at the Abbey, and her impoverished brother Stephen, a failed novelist, pays a visit in the hope of saving himself from destitution. The tension mounts as the 21st birthday of Ronnie Charles approaches. Oxford educated and an idealistic communist, young Ronnie has his own ideas about what to do when he comes of age and inherits Carlisle Abbey. At the time the book was written, Ronnie's political views were fashionable. The detective novelist Margaret Cole was among those who traveled to Russia, as Ronnie does just prior to his birthday, to marvel at the success of Stalin was making of his post-revolution society. The shadow of impending war looms over the people in the story, and the many subtle touches creating an atmosphere laden with doom provide a reminder that Kitchin was an accomplished author of literary fiction. Clifford Henry Ben Kitchin was, as H.R.F. Keating said, born with a whole handful of silver spoons in his mouth. After Oxford and training as a barrister, he increased his personal wealth through gambling at the Monte Carlo Casino, at racetracks. He bred greyhounds and on the London Stock Exchange. A talented classicist, botanist and pianist, he published a book of poems in 1919 and an acclaimed novel, Streamers Weaving, 6 years later, but his covert homosexuality and natural reserve meant that he never became a dominant establishment figure. His early books, including 2 detective novels, were published by the Hogarth Press, owned by Leonard and Virginia Woolf, who were intrigued by his experiments in the art of combining the emotions of everyday with violent catastrophe. Death of My Aunt introduced Malcolm Warren, whose career as an amateur detective spanned 20 years but only 4 books. Warren is, like his creator, a stockbroker, and share dealing and business skullduggery play a significant part in his second case, Crime at Christmas. Kitchin made good use of the tropes of detective fiction, but tried to do something fresh with them. In an unusual coda to the novel, Warren muses that the real justification of the detective story is that it provides a narrow but intensive view of the ordinary life, the steady flow of which is felt more keenly through the very violence of its interruption. Julian Simmons said in Bloody Murder that Kitchin brought nothing new to the crime story, although he has his place as a minor, amiable farcier, which suggests that Simmons never came across Birthday Party. This was rather the story of Kitchin's literary life. Even in his heyday, his finest work received less attention than it deserved.